today. We've got some great speakers to follow. My name is Jim Moran. I'm a senior fellow here at CEPS. I'm a former EU official, diplomat. I have to say that I'm not an expert on NATO, but I don't need to be because we have some great knowledge which will be imparted to us a little later. Just a few words from me to open up the discussions. Obviously, this summit coming up in Washington is a key summit. They always are, but this one more than ever, given events to the east of us. Of course, many positives. I think Sweden will attend for the first time as a full member of NATO, which is a very good thing. I think we're all agreed about that. A lot of big questions on the agenda. One of them, perhaps, should or should not accession talks with Ukraine be started, is one of the recommendations of the high-level group, of course, that's come out just recently, and many other things besides. And apart from that, a lot of events, of course, have been taking place in the last month which impact on this, and I guess the speakers will bring that in as we go through the discussion. Just to mention a few, we've had the, of course, European Parliament elections. We've had a strengthened far-right presence, which is not necessarily good news for those who believe in the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion, particularly France, where the Rassemblement National has strengthened its presence in the European Parliament and sparked an election in that very important country at the heart of Europe. And we'll have to see how that plays out in the next few weeks and whether or not there could be any consequences for French participation in the effort to support Ukraine. We have also the outcome of that, which is likely, I suppose, we don't know yet, but they're meeting today, I believe, the leaders, to confirm the top jobs, or at least to discuss the top jobs, which I guess will come up later on in the European Union. And Mrs. von der Leyen does look to be in a rather strong position after the elections, as you all know. Should that happen, that will also have some impact, it seems to many, on the effort on Ukraine, given the position that she's taken over the last few years. And the new commission is probably in the business of continuity when it comes to support for Ukrainian resistance. We have also the Swiss Peace Summit just completed, of course. Good attendance and some good announcements. And Turkey, amongst others, did sign the communique, which I thought was quite interesting. On the other hand, many did not. And we have a real problem there with the so-called Global South, as we all know. Many weren't present, or if they were present, they didn't take action. We've had countries like Brazil and others keeping quite some distance between their position and what is going on in supporting resistance in Ukraine. And we are being accused all the time, those who support Ukraine, of double standards when it comes to Gaza. And that is something we can't avoid. How best to deal with that question, how best to do better in terms of the outreach on Ukraine to the Global South. There's another question which perhaps one or two of the speakers might want to address. We've had so many things. We've had also the $50 billion loan against Russian frozen assets announced by the G7 recently, and other things besides. But that's enough from me. I think to get into the weeds of all of this, so as I say, we've got some great speakers. We're going to start with Rachel Alhost. She's on the board there, and she's the US Secretary of Defense representative here in Europe, and defense advisor to the US mission to NATO. So Rachel, perhaps you can kick us off, and I leave it to you to see which questions you want to address, but over to you. Join us, and you can either speak from here or you can speak from there, whichever you prefer.
Okay, I will speak from here just to keep it a little collegial and keep the water close. I have a scratchy throat, so I'll do my best. Well, thanks for having me. This is a really timely discussion. We just had our defense ministers in town last week, and we had an informal foreign ministerial a few weeks ago, so all building towards the summit. I thought I'd kick you off with what the United States, as the host, is thinking about priorities for the summit. And I know we've got Angus up next, and he can go in a bit more detail about some of the deterrence and defense work that the alliance is undertaking. But I'll give you some wave tops since we are the hosts this year. As you've seen throughout the year, we've got a number of important anniversaries. It's not just 75 years since NATO's founding. We also are celebrating 25 years since the Central and Eastern European allies joined, and Partnership for Peace as well. So what NATO started more than 25 years ago in terms of enlargement, but also stronger partnerships, continues today. So that's something that will be reflected at the 75th anniversary celebration as well. We're thinking about how we can include partners, including Southern partners, in some of the events, including alongside foreign ministers. So we want to continue that legacy. So in short, this Washington Summit has to be celebratory, but it really can't just be a celebration. We've got important work to do given the strategic context that Jim laid out. For the United States, I'd highlight 3 priorities. 1, responsibility sharing. 2, deterrence and defense. And 3, Ukraine and NATO's partnerships. So on deterrence and defense, you've probably seen a lot or heard this going on in NATO channels, particularly around the defense ministerial last week, but it's not something that always grabs the headlines. Since 2014, NATO has been undergoing a significant strengthening of its deterrence and defense agenda. We now have a new family of plans that cover the entire alliance. We are making better use of in-place and host nation forces. We have improved or are in the process of improving NATO's command and control, the authorities that are available to SACEUR to move and stage and respond with the forces and capabilities he has. We're getting our logistics in order. And then we're exercising, validating, and improving readiness across the alliance. So all of these things really take NATO to what I call back to basics. Article 5 and that collective defense commitment that an attack against one is an attack against all. It's not that NATO's deterrence and defense wasn't strong, but this makes it stronger. It really brings it up to the current challenges in the world where we have to be at any given time watching various regions across the alliance and have a range of multi-domain options to put into play if there is an incident. We can't just rely on conventional capabilities. We really have to draw on cyber, hybrid, et cetera. Related with that, actually, is an acknowledgement that in some cases there are gaps. That's both due to years of underinvestment in defense, but also the level of assistance and support that allies have given to Ukraine. 99% of all assistance going to Ukraine comes from NATO allies. So we had shortfalls and capability gaps, but those have been exacerbated by the current situation, as well as a more demanding strategic environment. So a lot of energy is going towards filling those gaps and identifying where the most critical shortfalls are. This has a big tie over to the relationship with the European Union and individual nations in terms of looking at the defense industrial aspects of how we fill these gaps. We have, in our conversations with industry, so at Vilnius we agreed a defense production action plan that creates closer relationships with industry, that looks at how we can aggregate demand to give a more clear signal to industry about multi-year, multinational buys that may be coming their way. We've looked at where we have excess capacity, where we have under capacity, and we've looked at our supply chains. Where are there vulnerabilities? Where are the components of something like 155 munition that we've got, 3/4 of it, but we don't have the critical aspect of gunpowder. So as we go through this deterrence and defense agenda and these plans and capability lists, we're uncovering the need to really work very closely with industry and the private sector to fill those gaps. We have a lot of really good examples. A lot of you will be familiar with the German-led Sky Shield initiative, which looks at integrated air and missile defense in all 3 tiers and seeks to work with other allies and partners to get at some of those shortfalls. NATO's procurement agency, NSPA, has put on contract 1,000 PAC-3 missiles. So again, not having each individual nation go in and try to alleviate these gaps, but going in as a group will help lower costs, it will hopefully create economies of scale, and it will hopefully give industry the signal they need to increase production and get at some of those gaps. But at the same time as we're going back to basics, NATO has to remember that we have to keep up with the transformation agenda. We can't just hunker down and focus on the way that we fought during the Cold War. We have to have one eye towards transformation. So Washington will also be about aspects of that transformation. For example, cyber. I think you'll see allies, heads of state and government agreeing to some sort of regulations on what a trusted vendor looks like, what are the minimum requirements you need in your system to meet a baseline of cyber hygiene or cyber resilience, and how can the military, private sector, and civilian aspects of a government work together on cyber to have a more effective, timely response? Because right now we've got everybody kind of sitting in different spots in their own silos. So cyber is one element of that transformation agenda. Hybrid, only open the newspaper on any given day and you will see a real uptick in incidents of sabotage across alliance territory. That can be arson attacks, that can be disinformation, that can be weaponization of immigration. Those are all things that we shouldn't panic about, but we have to be vigilant about. And as an alliance, we have to think through, together with the EU and individual countries, how we respond. Can we exchange information and intelligence? Can we look at our critical infrastructure and make sure it's resilient and has adequate protections? And then, of course, emerging and disruptive technologies. And Angus's team has done a good job of looking at the conventional capabilities and how you might overlay some more transformational aspects like, you know, big data or AI or you know, even taking some of the examples of what Ukraine has done with pairing autonomous systems and sensors with more conventional platforms. That's something that NATO needs to do if it's going to retain its technological edge over adversaries. We have to fight in a new way, we have to learn lessons, and we have to adapt quickly. So that's bucket one, that whole deterrence and defense agenda with the back to basics of collective defense in Article 5, but that transformational angle on top of it. That alone would be a very robust agenda, but we've got two more. It's Washington, it's an election year. I'm sure I'll get all those questions coming up. But therefore, it is important for the United States as the host to show and showcase the progress that has been made on responsibility sharing or burden sharing. And there, I think we have a good story to tell across the board. We talk about cash capabilities and contributions. In terms of cash, I think the Secretary General is in Washington today and throughout the week, and we'll be making some announcements potentially on how many allies are projected to meet that 2% target. But by my latest calculations, it's at least 2/3 of the alliance, possibly more. So we had 3 in 2014. We now have over 20 in 2024. That's pretty significant progress on the 2% metric. And allies are also spending better. More of that money is going towards new procurement and research and development, again, to make sure we're retaining that edge. On the capabilities side, a lot of good work being done to look at the plans that Angus's team works on and align that with capability targets and get at some of those critical gaps. And in terms of contributions, allies have really stepped up to align forces and capabilities against those plans. So they're not just on paper, they've got real sets of capabilities behind them and will be exercised and refined as such. So again, I feel pretty confident about the burden sharing story we have to tell at Washington. The final piece is, of course, Ukraine. So I saved the best for last. This is an area where NATO has been involved for quite some time. We have a comprehensive assistance package with Ukraine. Just the other day, we had a nook with them. They sit at the table with all the other 32 allies in alphabetical order and have an equal voice in that conversation. So in that nook format, it feels like Ukraine is a member. Ukraine is definitely already has a seat at the table. But as we hear on a daily basis, their ultimate aspiration, and ours as well, I believe, is to bring Ukraine into NATO. So how do we, as NATO, make sure that everything we're doing to support Ukraine in the near term is also married up with assistance and support that gets them closer to that objective of becoming a NATO member? I think that is got about 3 pieces, and I'll try to be short. One is continuing to work with Ukraine on the defense reform and capacity building tasks that nest under their annual national plan. Things like procurement reform, helping them build an integrated air and missile defense system. Those are all things that are already underway under existing NATO assistance. But we need to put that assistance on firmer footing and signal that it's an enduring commitment and it is that bridge to membership. So at the defense ministers meeting last week, we had agreement on a new NATO security assistance and support for Ukraine, which has the unfortunate acronym of INSATU. But nested under that is a lot of important work. NATO will take on more coordination of training. It will play a greater role in cohering short-term assistance with the long-term force that Ukraine seeks to build and make sure that it's interoperable with NATO. The way I think about it now is we have a lot of work that's meaningful that's going on, but it's happening in different places. And sometimes it's a bit ad hoc, and it's not always joined up under a single umbrella. So we have the bilateral security MOUs. We have the great work that the EU is doing on training and some industry cooperation. We have work NATO's already doing that I laid out. We have work on the capability coalitions and the future force. So how do you make sure when you're giving Ukraine a fighter aircraft or a tank or a piece of munition, that it's something that they can use, that it's value added, and that what you're giving them for the now is something that's feeding into a future force that makes them better able to withstand future attacks and pressure from Russia. We have to start to rationalize that support, and that's where NATO has a long history in helping countries make sure that they're moving towards interoperability with NATO. So in short, I think a lot of very important things going on for the summit. I have no doubt that the conversations on Ukraine will sort of overtake the headlines, but I just wanted to highlight for all of you that there's some pretty impressive longstanding work that's been going on in NATO to ramp up the deterrence and defense agenda, focus on transformation, and make sure everybody around that table of 32 is pulling their weight. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. I think you'll all agree that was an excellent presentation. Gives us sets the scene very well for discussions on the summit. Just one question from me, and I mentioned this earlier. There are those that argue that an announcement on accession talks for Ukraine would have a very strong deterrent effect on Putin. Do you think at all that might be a possibility at this summit? You don't have to say yes or no.
Well, if I compare it to the EU accession process, they are different. I mean, NATO doesn't really have that interim step of opening accession talks and then going through all the acquis chapter by chapter. It would almost be a bit of an artificial step that we created to keep them in yet another waiting room. I think that creates more frustration than putting real meaningful work on the table. Already at Vilnius, we got rid of the membership action plan requirement as a prerequisite for membership. So that is almost already a sort of fast track. So I understand the symbolic value of it, but I don't think it has the same impact that it has in an EU context where you open that door and you start a formal process.
Great, thanks. Well, then let's move on and ask Angus Lapsley, who is the Assistant Sec-Gen at NATO for Defence Planning, to join us. Angus, if you take the mic, over to you.
Well, thanks, Jim, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So, Rachel's given such a clear overview of so much of what is happening. I might just sort of change a little bit what I say, because I think that so the Washington Summit, I have in my mind's eye an iceberg, and I think that's partly because I'm worried about how hot it's going to be in Washington. But what I mean by that is that a lot of the substance will be below the surface. A lot of the substance probably won't cut through the media reporting, and I think the media's focus quite rightly will be on what the summit does for Ukraine, maintaining our unity of purpose on Ukraine, moving forward on support for Ukraine as Rachel has set out. But sort of underneath the surface, there is quite a profound transformation of NATO as an alliance going on at the moment. And it is driven essentially by the realization that sort of started hitting us in 2014, as Rachel says, but it sort of really hit people in 2022, that the alliance and Europe have to be prepared for the possibility of open conflict. We have to be prepared to deter an attack on us, and if necessary, to stop it and defeat it. And I think that there was a quite important sort of psychological threshold was crossed in the beginning of 2022. So a lot of countries, my own, for example, the UK, they had been sort of very focused on the extent to which Russia was becoming an aggressive threat to European security, at least since 2014. But there was probably a sense, I think, deep down, that Russia would always choose to provoke us underneath the threshold of open conflict. They would use cyber attacks, they would mess with our space assets, they would do disinformation, they would do all of those sort of, as we say, hybrid things to compete with us and provoke us. But they wouldn't really be stupid enough to actually launch an open war in Europe. And I think the confidence in that judgment was dramatically reduced by what happened at the beginning of 2022 and the full scale of Putin's ambitions and his risk appetite and what he wants to do to European security, which is fundamentally to rip it up and restart again on Russian terms in a way which would be completely unacceptable to all of the democracies of Europe and the transatlantic area. So NATO is right back to thinking about Article 5. What do we do to defend ourselves? And ideally, to prevent an attack ever happening on us in the first place. And that is a very fundamental shift for the militaries, in particular of Europe. Because instead of thinking about providing relatively small numbers of forces on a rotational basis to send them somewhere else in the world to sort out somebody else's security problems, you are back in the game of working out what volume of forces you need to defend your own territory, your own airspace, your own waters. And the thing about Article 5 is you don't get to decide where it happens, you don't get to decide when it happens, you don't get to decide how it happens, you don't get to decide how long it goes on for. The other side initiates and sets the parameters for a lot of this. So we as an alliance have to go back into a mindset, which of course we had during the Cold War, and see how we can adapt that to the very changed geographical circumstances of NATO now. We're a lot physically bigger than we were in the Cold War. And as Rachel was saying, the kind of dramatically different technologies and way in which war happens. So I would draw out sort of three things that are happening as part of this underlying transformation. So firstly, there's a deep military transformation. Our militaries are having to think again about mass. How do you have enough of things? How do you keep going in a fight beyond a couple of days? You might have to go for months, as Ukraine has shown. So that takes you to issues around the depth of stocks, ammunition stocks, supplies, spare parts, people that you can keep going. You have to think about scale, and a lot of our militaries have been focused on quite small-scale operations, and this casts a long shadow. So, for example, our medical support for our militaries has become fantastically good at providing bespoke treatment to small numbers of injured people. Which is great if you are doing special forces operations somewhere. It's not if you are looking after large numbers of battlefield casualties, as the Ukrainians are now dealing with. And they're doing amazingly well, by the way. The Russians tend to just leave their casualties on the battlefield because it's cheaper and easier to let them die on the battlefield than bring them back and try and look after them. So that return to scale and to that kind of planning for large-scale, long-duration, high-intensity warfare is a real challenge for our militaries. In terms of the progress we've made over the last 12 months, even since the Vilnius Summit, I think we are making some really significant progress. So one of the things we did at the beginning of the year was, beginning of the year, the school year that began with the end of the the Vilnius Summit, was go to allies and say, we need a much clearer idea of what forces you would make available to Saka in a crisis. What could he call upon? And you'll recall that we, in particular, said we need at least 300,000 people at high readiness, by which we mean ready to move in about 30 days. In fact, we have gone to allies and said to them, essentially, anything you've got, we would expect to have it. In a crisis, and the vast majority of them come back and said, yes, if we've got it, you've got it. And as a result, we've actually comfortably exceeded the 300,000 figure that we asked for at Vilnius. We're nearer 500,000 now. So that kind of process of identifying forces is going on and has made some real progress. Then you get to, okay, what capabilities do we not have as opposed to not being available to NATO? And there are some challenges, and we know that there are areas like integrated air and missile defense, deep precision fires, complex land maneuver capabilities, logistics and enablement, and the kind of clever IT systems that support modern command and control in a multi-domain environment. These are all areas where we need investment, and we're going to need more capability, in particular in Europe. And at the moment, we have much the highest level of American military engagement in Europe that we've had since the end of the Cold War. Americans have lent in very heavily to the forces we require. But we also know that given other global commitments, that isn't a check we can keep cashing. Europeans need to generate more of the capabilities that will allow us to fight. All of this is going to take money, and Rachel has touched on money, and the story there is a lot better. The SecGen is going to announce the figures quite shortly while he's in Washington. But to give you a sense of the ballpark we're in, the increase in defence spending by Europe and Canada over the last 12 months is the equivalent roughly to adding France and Norway to the alliance. So there is a lot of extra money going into defence across Europe. But this investment will take time. It takes 7 or 8 years to build an NCO. It takes a couple of years to build a tank and longer to build a frigate. All of these things will take time to generate capability, which is one of the reasons why we are also pushing allies to look at what they can do in the short term to make the forces they've already got more effective. And that's about things like having ammunition stocks, which you can generate more quickly. So time and money. It'll also take people. And one of the issues which all European militaries are grappling with at the moment is how do you find people, and the right people, because the skills that modern warfighters require are quite different in some ways to traditional models. The second point I'd want to make is this isn't just a transformation for Europe's militaries. It's also for the way our civilian authorities think about the way they interact with the military. So Rachel touched on one part of that, which is industrial policy, and that's pretty critical. But another part of it is the planning that you need to do as a civilian authority for what war would actually be like. So if you think about what the road to a conflict or crisis might be in Europe, Saka, using the authorities that we have granted him in the last 12 months, as Rachel was saying, he would be moving forces around Europe. Not starting a fight, but he'd be moving forces so that we're in the right place, so that the Russians looked and said there's no point attacking there at any given time. Just moving one armoured brigade across Europe is a thing. It requires a lot of space, a lot of time, huge amounts of fuel and vehicles, etc. In practice, we would be looking to move divisions and even corps around Europe. So the civilian planning that goes into that is something that countries haven't really had to deal with since the Cold War. The access to fuel and water and space and shelter, medical facilities, all of those things. So we would be doing some quite exceptional things. But at the same time, to pick up another point that Rachel made, quite exceptional things would be being done to us. So I think we're pretty certain that if we were in that kind of road to crisis, the level of hybrid attacks that Russia would be launching against us would go up dramatically. It's a pretty high level already. So we also need to have our civilian authorities to be resilient enough to be able to do those exceptional things, even whilst somebody is trying very hard to disrupt them. So that's about cybersecurity, physical security, human security, and it's about good planning. So one of the things we're going to push at Washington is the idea that all of our countries need some kind of mechanism or structure which allows military and civilian planning to happen together. And it's not just about frontline countries. It's not, there are countries like Finland who have never stopped doing this and are amazingly good at it. But actually, it's also about what we would call rear area countries. Here in Belgium, the port of Antwerp will be absolutely critical to any large-scale effort. So are we ready here to protect the port of Antwerp, keep it functioning, even when all sorts of methods are being tried to disrupt it? The last point I just make is about deterrence, because NATO as an alliance has always really been about deterrence. We know that if we have to fight, we will fight, but our job really is to prevent us ever getting to that point. And I think we have to sort of increasingly think of our deterrence as happening in layers. We have to present a picture to Russia in particular that says, look, there's no particular layer of activity where we're more vulnerable and you can seek advantage. So the first layer is we have to be pushing back and defending ourselves against hybrid attacks, space, cyber, disinformation, assassinations are happening, sabotage, etc. The second layer is a conventional defense. And one of the lessons of Ukraine is you're much more likely to be threatened with nuclear weapons if you have already ceded some advantage conventionally. You never want to get in that position of having ceded any ground conventionally. So that's why everything from tanks and drones and artillery, all that stuff really, really, really still matters to NATO. And then thirdly, we have to make sure our nuclear deterrence is absolutely solid as well. And we believe it is. And I think a lot of the care that Russia has taken not to cross conventional thresholds with NATO over the last 2 years, despite all the things we're doing to support Ukraine, comes from Russia's respect for our nuclear deterrence. But we've also had to deal with Russia's irresponsible and aggressive nuclear posturing over the last 2 years. And it's a difficult one because you're sort of, whenever anybody threatens you with nuclear weapons, you have to take that really seriously. On the other hand, if it's happening almost weekly, it's difficult to know how seriously to take it. But what we do is focus incredibly seriously on making sure that our own nuclear deterrence is fit for purpose. Now, that is about investment in capabilities. And the three nuclear powers in NATO, UK, US and France, are all investing heavily in modernising their own nuclear deterrence at the moment. But so too are the wider group of countries that support NATO's own nuclear mission. So those countries that fly dual-capable aircraft or whose conventional militaries would support that nuclear mission. And those countries are also investing heavily. So it's partly about investment in capability. It's partly about doing the thinking, making sure we really understand what does it mean to deter Russia, this new Russia, which is not the Russia of the Soviet Union's period. It's quite different in many ways. Are we sure we understand how we do that? And thirdly, it's about communicating it. So deterrence is all about communication. And that's why we've done quite a lot of exercising and communicating what we do. So those, for me, are the three resets that we're doing: a military defense reset, a relationship between civilian and military reset, and a deterrence. I wouldn't call it reset because it's always been there, but a determination to make sure we're good on that.
Many thanks, Angus. If you allow one question from my side, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this one. The EU itself, of course, has become much more involved in the defense area in the last few years. There are new initiatives on the books, some of them already taken, and maybe more to come, although I suspect it might be a bit more difficult with the European Parliament going forward. But my question is, how significant do you see those as contributing to the overall effort on capabilities and so on and so forth, defense procurement, research? Will this be a significant addition, do you think, to the armory of tools, the toolbox, to use that terrible phrase, for NATO as well in years to come? What do you think?
I think it certainly adds something. I mean, the organisation of collective defence, the planning, the structures, the identification of capabilities, etc., that is pretty firmly NATO's business, and it doesn't help to duplicate that. And I don't think that is what the European Union is trying to duplicate. And that function alone, is going to drive 90% of the bandwidth of European defence for the next generation, frankly. The European Union then has a significant role in terms of sort of stabilization, crisis management operations around the world. That's all to the good. It's not NATO, I think, is less likely to focus on that kind of activity for the foreseeable future. And then there is a defence industrial role that the EU is developing, which, if it promotes cooperation between European defence industries, gets them to be more efficient and deliver more, would be good. I mean, I think that budget is still, relatively speaking, quite small in comparison to the budgets of individual states. But if it can promote better cooperation, then that would be good for NATO. I think the only issue that is sometimes debated in NATO is, there are already the defence industrial sector is already very complex with a lot of national regulatory responsibilities, lots of national political interests involved. We don't want to see the transatlantic defence base becoming any more divided than it already is. So we would like to see the European Union develop its defence industrial cooperation in a way that allowed for cooperation with non-EU countries as well as just within the EU.
Yeah, interesting. Can we then move on to Minna Alander from Finland, from the Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki, who's going to make a few comments on the presentations that we've had up to now. Minna, over to you.
Thank you very much. Interesting to listen from a Finnish perspective. We are now headed towards our second summit as members, and we are incredibly relieved in Finland that this will be Sweden's first as full member of the alliance. This was indeed something that was casting a shadow on our first year, or almost the total first year in the alliance, that Sweden's accession process was delayed further. So this was threatening to become an actual very practical problem for us in Finland too, because we have very extensive bilateral cooperation with Sweden, and Sweden is just so central, like literally geographically central to our region, that it's incredibly important that Sweden is on board now as well, and we can actually get into this like NATO defense planning process and the regional plans together with Sweden, which totally like sort of connects the whole region from the southern Baltic Sea up to the Norwegian high north. So this was a huge relief and great news from the Finnish perspective. So for Finland, it's an interesting time to have joined NATO, because like somehow it was nothing short of a wonder, but we somehow managed to hit the right moment to join the alliance. Given that our security needs and our threat perception is currently perfectly aligned with NATO's. This was not always the case, because for Finland, the main issue has always been territorial defense, which was not at all on NATO's agenda for during the 30 years peace, as I like to call it. And so at the moment, as was already mentioned here, Finland has many of the systems in place, still sort of like Cold War style, that we never abolished after the Cold War, and that makes things sort of easier for us, because now many people wish that they had the same conscription-based large reserve army and so on, and this actual fourth generation ability that Finland currently has. So basically there were two reasons why Finland decided to join NATO 2 years ago, and those were somewhat surprisingly perhaps to outside observers, but mainly security of supply and deterrence. We are somewhat of an island with the long border to Russia close now, and that is like our main land connection. Then there's like a land connection to the west through northern Sweden and Finland. So that is why the Arctic is also a very important issue from a Finnish perspective, especially from the security of supply angle. Otherwise, we are very dependent on the Baltic Sea communication line. So here again, great to have Sweden on board as well. And then deterrence. It has been mentioned here a couple of times. Angus just laid out the principles, what it's based on, and obviously there was this understanding in Finland 2 years ago that we may have like a good level of sort of national let's say conventional deterrence, if you can. It sounds weird to talk about it like in the case of a very small country like Finland, but we're actually, like, in terms of security and defense, we are not such a small country, almost by European standards a little bit of a military superpower, and that's because the bar is rolling somewhere on the floor, not because Finland is so great. But anyways, so we realized that we don't want to be subject or like easy prey for nuclear threats, and that was so the nuclear deterrence that NATO provides through the US extended deterrence. There's sort of like this understanding that there's no deterrence like nuclear deterrence, and we want to have it too. So our main concern about, like, the election year was mentioned, and of course with the US elections is not so much maybe like concrete troop commitments or like permanent presence of the United States in our territory. Of course, there has been massive training and exercise activity, and the US has been very present in Finland, like almost nonstop, the UK too, and Norwegians as well. But the main concern from a Finnish perspective is perhaps the sustained credibility of the US extended deterrence. And that is sort of more the thing that keeps us awake at night. Then just to mention two more things that were also brought up here. EU-NATO cooperation. There has been a couple of interesting examples, especially in the hybrid field, where Finland has resorted rather to EU kind of tools than NATO, despite already having been member in NATO. Could be that we're not very used to thinking that NATO is also an option yet, but I would like to see this more as a very good example of how there is this complementarity and how EU can also play a role on the escalation management ladder. So with the Baltic Connector gas pipeline that was damaged last October between Finland and Estonia, Finland, for example, activated the EU hybrid toolbox. In that case, and then also with the migration situation at the Finnish border, where Russia started instrumentalizing migrants and pushing them over the Finnish border last fall, as soon as the war started going better for Russia, by the way. So it's important to take note of this. So there, Finland also requested support from the EU border agency Frontex, not NATO consultations. So I think that there's a lot of good potential there, if only we can get over certain political issues that have been blocking more fruitful EU-NATO cooperation. So I think I'll leave it there.
Many thanks, many thanks. Yes, indeed. I think the size of the Finnish army is 400,000, am I right?
It's 280,000 wartime troop strength, plus a reserve up to 870,000.
Good Lord. So it's your core strength is 3 times the size of the British army, Angus. Isn't that? It's quite a revelation, isn't it, to hear that?
Yeah, although of course the Finnish numbers are based on essentially reservists. So then they're civilians who are called up for service each year. So the actual professional army is relatively small, I think, isn't it? Yeah.
There you are, showing my ignorance. I do apologize for that. But nevertheless, it's good to know that Finland's on board. Finally, we have, last but no means least, we have Harry Nedelsu. If I've got the name right. I'm sorry, Harry, if I haven't got the Senior Director of Geopolitics at Rasmussen.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yes, I handle the geopolitical practice at Rasmussen Global, the political advisory of Anders for Rasmussen, and also our Ukraine work. So maybe predictably, I'll probably bring the conversation back to Ukraine. And here, I think it's important to step back and ask a fundamental question, which is, do we think that we are doing enough? And then the second part of that question is, enough for what? We used to say enough for Ukraine to deliver victory, and we never really defined what victory looked like. But we no longer even say that now. Now we say enough so that we can at least lay the foundations of a peace talks for Ukraine. And I think the answer is, do we deliver enough? And do we think that the summit coming up helps towards that? I think the answer is no. We see the Russians making gains on the ground almost every day, carrying out brutal attacks against Ukrainian cities. And that is a result of our hesitance. That is a result of our delay. We tend to debate rather than act. We debated when it came to the tanks, the long-range missiles, the F-16s, and meanwhile, Russia escalates. So our strategy is not working because we're doing a little bit too little too late. And despite the assistance that we give, Putin's calculus is that he can outlast us. He can outlast Western support and still make gains. And therefore, there's zero incentives for real actual peace talks. And this is why we see him making the statements that he makes, because he's not really interested in peace talks. So fundamentally, we have to think of something else. We need to think of something new. And here I will bring in a few recommendations that we did issue with our international working group, which Rasmussen co-chairs with the Office of the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, in order to change a bit that paradigm. And I'll focus on 3 recommendations. The first is, especially since this NATO summit is coming up, seriously think about issuing an invite to Ukraine. An invite doesn't mean that Ukraine becomes a member tomorrow. So Article 5 doesn't kick in tomorrow. There are actual steps between invitation and all the way to membership. And Sweden and Finland illustrated that. And also it can take quite a long time between the time you get an invite and the time you get to become full member. And typically, after you get an invite to start actual talks. So all the reform Ukraine has to do, all the things that Ukraine still has to fulfill, can be a part of those talks. And it can even be an incentive for Ukraine to actually carry out those reforms, knowing that there's membership somewhere at the horizon. And then to address Rachel's point that we shouldn't take them from one waiting room to another, which is true. An invite just like that would actually put them into this new limbo. But we can actually give a due date. We can actually, or a target date, and say by this and that date, if, of course, Ukraine fulfills its conditions, then they would become members. And then asking the Ukraine NATO Council, the new NATO-Ukraine Council, to define exactly what those conditions would be. Because at Vilnius, there's still a lot of, there's a lack of clarity. What are the conditions that Ukraine has to meet? No one has actually said what those conditions are. But giving that clarity would actually change a lot, in Putin's mind especially. It would change his calculus, since one of the main reasons for starting this war was to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. It would send a message that we are actually serious when we say that we're there for them as long as it takes, and I'm going to go ahead with membership eventually. It would force him to actually want to lock in and seek an end to this war. That's the second point. And the third point is, short of membership and short of invite, there are other things we can still do to limit the parameters of the war with a view to ending the war. So for instance, we have this 2%, 2.5% target of defense out of GDP for defense. We could set aside 0.25% of GDP for assisting Ukraine militarily. And meanwhile, unfreeze the 300 billion of Russian assets towards reconstruction. That's another one. Second, we could, for instance, have in-country training in Ukraine, including in-country missions. Something that was brought up by President Macron, but now, of course, with the situation in France, knowing how it is, having that picked up by other leaders and at least making steps towards that. And it could start at the NATO summit. And finally, support for air defense. I just came from Ukraine yesterday. So I was in Kiev, I was in Odessa. And of course, we all know about the power cuts and how severe they are and how, with the coming winter, this could be another problem. But actually, the Ukrainians are doing quite a good job at repairing their infrastructure. So the power cuts are still there, but the situation is getting better. It's not an issue of whether they will manage to repair them by winter. They will. But the problem is one of air defense. Because if they don't have the air defense they need, the Russians will keep attacking them, especially with winter coming. So starting with supporting the German initiative, but then also thinking about, for instance, whether we could have an extended air defense shield over Western Ukraine. So an area of responsibility, a NATO area of responsibility over Western Ukraine. That would allow Ukrainians to shift resources from the West and reallocate them to the East, and it would be of great help. So I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry, and that's interesting. I'm going to turn this over to the audience in just a moment, but in the meantime, I'm just going to ask our other panelists, particularly Rachel and Angus, whether they want to comment on what Harry just said, particularly on the ideas of issuing some sort of invitation to Ukraine. But not only that, also the frozen assets recommendation, the in-country training. If there's anything you'd like to add to what you already said, I think you did actually touch on one or two of these aspects along the way, but I think it's an interesting debate. So over to you, Rachel, if you'd like to say anything more.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the work that's being done outside of NATO and the EU. Sorry, to think creatively about what more we can be doing for Ukraine to lean in. Certainly, a lot of those good ideas have been imported and discussed and debated within NATO. I mean, I guess with regard to issuing an invite, I really do still ask myself the question: what more could we do if that step is taken than what we're doing now? Because we really do already have a process whereby Ukraine is at the table with us. We're going through the list of reforms that would need to be completed in order for them to become members. And again, it's not just a black and white list of you check these 10 boxes and then you become a member on X date. There are also political considerations. Unfortunately, as we saw with Sweden and Finland, they met every criteria for membership. And then when it came to a decision at 30 around the table, it took a year or 2 years. So again, I like the idea and I want it to be attractive and an option, but I do worry that it's, instead of sending the signal that you want it to send to Putin that Ukraine will be a member imminently, it just sends a signal that you really got to move quickly to end this conflict so they never become a member. So I'd rather, continue to draw them closer and use this important time to really build that future force that's resilient and can withstand an attack. A financial pledge is definitely something that's under consideration. I think you've seen the Secretary General out there talking about the contours of that pledge. A lot of debate within NATO about how closely that should be tied to the 2% Wales defense investment pledge target. As it stands, some of that does count under the definition, some of it doesn't. If we buy the argument that helping Ukraine defend itself is really good for NATO and is really helping prevent an attack on NATO allies, then we really should be willing to extend that definition. So a financial pledge, as well as a stronger NATO representative presence in Kiev, are things that are already under discussion ahead of the summit.
I just add just 2 points on top of that. So, I mean, in practice, NATO and its allies are getting ever more involved in helping Ukraine as if, frankly, they were already on that membership process. So, for example, helping them with the design of their future force, which is partly about, what exactly do they need for the situation they face now, but also how are they going to integrate with the rest of NATO once they become a member. We're kind of doing that work already. The Vilnius Summit last year set up the NATO-Ukraine Council, which is now meeting regularly, which means Ukraine is often around the table in NATO already, literally. So to some extent, we're walking down that road anyway. I think the second point is, and this cuts to some of the ideas like air defense shields, etc. So NATO has been very clear from the beginning of this conflict that we were not going to get directly involved in the conflict. Now, you can debate whether that was the right judgment or not, but the reality is that line that we hold, I think, has made it a lot easier for a lot of countries politically to lean into helping Ukraine. They have not had to deal with a domestic political debate about are we being sucked into a war, because it's very clear that NATO's view is we're not being sucked into a war. And I think if you play with that boundary, then that will have impact on the political support that has been maintained across the alliance for helping Ukraine. So it has its pros and cons, but one quite important pro is it's allowed that political support to stay.
Thank you. Right, I think I have some sympathy with this. I was physically present at the Bucharest summit in 2008 with João Manuel Barroso, there for Afghanistan at the time, when, of course, Ukraine, a promise of sorts was made to Ukraine about Ukraine membership, which couldn't be delivered. One has to be very careful about these things. Right, we're going to take questions for the panel, and we'll take them in groups of 3. Gentlemen in the front here. Please be brief, and tell us who you are.
Thank you for the floor. Dmitry Shkurko, National News Agency of Ukraine. My first question to Rachel, if I may. Secretary General of NATO and Secretary Blinken and recently Secretary Austin said that in Washington will be built some kind of bridge of steel for Ukraine membership. Could you please elaborate a little bit that issue, especially as we read recently the publication in Atlantic Council that it could be some kind of creative ideas. For instance, like providing to Ukraine the observer status in NATO structures, including the NEC. And if I may, to Mr. Angus, if I may. If you follow the Russian rhetorics, recently they directly threatening publicly threatening to take a nuclear blow, not to Ukraine, because Ukraine is too maybe close to them and they will be hitting themselves, but to the NATO countries, including Baltic states and Poland. And they, in their public rhetorics, they are absolutely sure that NATO will not be responding in that blow if it will be small, conventional, not conventional, but tactical nuclear weapons used. So how can you comment on that? So what could Russians expect? And one small comment to Mr. Nedelko statement. I would not trust to Mr. Putin goodwill or even promises. As you know, he publicly stated that attacking NATO from Russian side could be a madness. I could be worried from the NATO side, because exactly that was the point that he said before attacking Ukraine. And you need all to know that in their mind, they are not fighting now with Ukraine. They are fighting with NATO already now. So be ready, please.
Thank you. Lady over there in the white blouse. Second row. That's you. Yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, actually, dear colleagues. I'll continue my colleague who was from Ukraine, Viktoria Vdovichenko, from Ukraine as well, Center for Defense Strategies, Program Director for Security Studies. I wanted to ask our first 2 panelists about the coalitions and the future, because we have a capability coalitions, and I think you haven't touched upon in your introductory remarks. When we are thinking about capability coalitions, we are thinking how to, as from Ukrainian expert point of view, to take, let's say, crisis management approach to more what we say strategic approach. At the same time, we also heard that Rammstein format is not going to be integrated to the NATO format. So what will be your reflections on that in this regard? And well, I will just also comment on 2 things. Harry, you're absolutely right. People do not know here what the blackouts are, but we do. And it's important that Ukrainian experts and also the Ukrainian voices are much more on that. On another moment and another note on the things, I do actually see how NATO will be responding that these red lines that the Russian Federation is already posing on you, and unfortunately there is not much of the efforts. Firstly, there were red lines for the F-16s. They are passed, as you know. Then were some more of the red lines. Now the preparations for the nukes. Are we ready to tackle that? Thank you.
Thank you. And we have the lady on the front row here, please.
Hello, my name's Sandra Kaduri from Keeping Channels Open, a dialogue network. Quick things. Rachel, you said don't panic about hybrid. Shouldn't we be doing more actually to alert people in our countries about the dangers given the rise of the far right, increased polarization, real world effects of election and referenda, of interference and fusion with malign actors domestically? If we want a whole of society approach in Western Europe, which we don't have, and we do have that in the Baltics, but not in Western Europe. And second, on the global south, I noticed that India, South Africa, Saudi did not sign up to the peace summit declarations this weekend. What more can be done to persuade those countries that they should turn against Russia at least somewhat?
Thank you. That's quite a menu. So let's go back to the panel, and we'll start, I think, first with you, Harry, and then work our way down.
Yeah. On the question of what more could a NATO invite do? Again, here we have to think they're not just costs to taking a decision that, yes, it is risky. A NATO invite is risky. There are risks associated to it. There's also costs associated to doing nothing. Doing nothing is also risky because it sends a message to Putin that actually his red lines maybe do work, and that we do lack unity, and that there are things that we're not willing to do. So it actually empowers him to keep going forward. In terms of his red lines, you mentioned his red lines. He always set these red lines, and somehow we managed to always overcome them. So it's important not to allow him to make these red lines, in our minds at least, written in stone. Putin, I think, has proven to us that he'll threaten us, and then the threats kind of just dissipate, and then we keep doing it. So I wouldn't put too much. I wouldn't let Putin control the narrative, including the nuclear narrative, which we've been very bad at in terms of the way we handle. On the global south, real quick, what could Ukraine do better? It's something I've noticed. But Ukrainians are getting better at this. A lot of times, Ukrainians present themselves and approach the global south together with us, with the West, which is not that useful, because the West, in the eyes of many in the global south, doesn't have a great story to tell. Ukrainians are better, actually, when they approach the global south on their own. Then they have a similar story. They've both been colonized. They've both been victims. And there are ways in which they can actually connect better than if they do it together with us. I've noticed they're starting to do that a little bit more, but yes, it's still an issue. I mean, we saw how many actually signed, and it wasn't that many.
Sorry, just to stay with you, Harry, for a second. I mentioned Gaza earlier. Now, it does play in this. What can they do about that from the Ukrainian point of view? Is there anything they should do or try to do in terms of making their case?
Ukrainians should tell their story. Ukrainians have their story that they need to tell. It's not about making comparisons, and it's not about, Ukraine has its story to tell that they need to communicate better to the global south. It's really that simple.
Mina?
Thanks. So there was no Finland-related question, but I could maybe react quickly to this idea that Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon, not necessarily in Ukraine, but against NATO countries. And to me, this logic doesn't quite add up, because like the Baltic states, Finland, Poland are like as close as Ukraine is to Russia. I mean, Helsinki is only like a couple 100 kilometers from St. Petersburg. Tends to make us a bit more relaxed about I mean, it would be then actually like a suicide also in St. Petersburg to nuke Helsinki. But so I don't see how that would make a whole lot more sense. So of course it also shows that there is a lot of lack of logic, of course, also to these threats. And what I would like to also emphasize is that it's fascinating how far Putin has gotten with purely rhetorical threats. Like there have been no, as far as I know, no changes to the posture that would indicate any imminent even testing or use. So Yeah, I think this is maybe part of this much talked nuclear IQ that we need to improve.
Well, just picking up on that, we've been a nuclear alliance for 75 years, and nuclear deterrence has always been the cornerstone of how we achieve broader deterrence. That hasn't changed. The Russians know that hasn't changed. They know our capabilities, they know our credibility, and they know the political intent we have. And that just hasn't changed. Now, what we have seen is Russia saying a lot of stuff about nuclear over the last 2 years. We very deliberately don't do a running commentary on that because I'm not sure it would actually help. And I don't really see how it's helping Russia either. So I disagree with Harry in that sense, actually. I think reacting to every time Medvedev or somebody pops up on television and makes some blood-curdling threat, they know what we've got, what we can do, and how we would respond.
Rachel?
Well, I feel like I got all the questions that nobody wanted to answer because I have to go last. There's like 7 left. All right, so the Bridge of Steel. I mean, I think this goes beyond NATO and what NATO's preparing for the summit. I think you need to look at the aggregate. You need to pull in all the bilateral MOUs and security commitments that have been completed, including the bilateral one between the US and Ukraine and EU and Ukraine, as well as others. I think by latest count, was there something like 13? But anyway, 16. So it's going up quite quickly. I think all of those matter, but we have to put them side by side, see what they entail, see what they leave out. Do they come with financial commitments? How can we leverage them in the bigger picture? Again, finances make a difference, so we'll be banging that drum. And I do think that the repurposing of some of the debt revenue is something that makes sense in order to support Ukraine, although not a NATO position, just part of the aggregate. One of the things that I think is most promising that's happening without any formal guidance is the level of integration between Ukrainian and Western industry, particularly on the defense sphere, but also on the energy sphere. I think, Ukraine has shown that, you've got a lot of technological expertise and do a lot of things much better than we do, whether it's, literally keeping the trains running, it's having a very resilient financial system, or it's really being very innovative with all the technological combinations you've brought out during the war. That's something that's definitely gaining attention in the Pentagon. It's gaining attention with U.S. defense industry, and they're moving out on building those relationships. And that's going to tie you to the West, regardless of whether that stamp of membership is there today or a year from now. And then the future force, I mean, what we're really trying to do here is to make sure, and this gets to the question about the capability coalitions, again, it's like, all right, you're getting an F-16. Let's think about what it takes to retain an F-16s. How many pilots does it require to be trained on what timeline? What sort of maintenance schedule does that have? What sort of weapons fly off of that? So we make sure that with the limited security assistance you have, you're buying the right stuff and you're getting that effect of being able to deter and defend in the same way Finland and Sweden were able to do when they were not members of the alliance. So I actually think you guys probably have a lot to learn from the example of Finland and Sweden in terms of how they built their relationship with NATO even when they were formally outside. Red lines, I think we've, you can say what you will about them, but there has been a willingness to debate and revisit. And while sometimes, yes, I do wish we'd moved a bit more quickly, the fact that we have taken that time to think and we have adjusted, I think is really important. So to my point earlier on, that those outside who have good ideas continue to push us and point out why maybe it doesn't make sense and we need to revisit our previously held assumptions. And ambiguity is good. I will give Mr. Macron credit there, that we can't always be spelling out what we won't or will do. On hybrid, I think we have an obligation to not panic, but we do have to educate our populations. Once again, lots of great examples in Finland, where every citizen knows what disinformation looks like. They go through courses, their media is very well educated about certain parameters and responsibilities. We have a lot to learn about how we can empower everyday citizens to spot disinformation or to spot sabotage or to spot investments in dual-use items that could really be catastrophic. But I think what people don't realize, they see these one-off events and they don't see it as a whole campaign. So there is some value in exposing and cataloging everything that's been going on and trying to see the patterns between them, because I think you do see patterns. I did some work on this when I was in the think tank community, and you could see that if it was before a European election or after a particularly bad day on the battlefield for the Russians, there was an uptick in the disinformation and the spin and the sabotage. So if we can expose and map these incidents, I think our responses will be a little bit more effective.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Time for more. Gentleman over there, I see you in the fifth row.
Hi, Bart Schlepczyk at Covington, the German Marshall Fund. I want to go back to the point of potentially sending troops to Ukraine and to flesh out that debate a little bit. What is your sense in terms of where the debate lies among European member states? Obviously, President Macron has come out in the lead, although he never specified whether he would want to send French troops or Polish or German or other troops. I think he left that ambiguous as well. The Polish foreign minister came out recently and said that under certain conditions he would, or the Polish government would consider sending troops to Ukraine, not only to train but also to fight if let's say, the momentum was going against us in the country. Finland, for its part, the Finnish president, the new Finnish president, Alex Stubb, has come out very strongly against sending Finnish troops. So where do you think, or can you share where you think the center of gravity lies within European member states of NATO? Thanks. And also maybe just to tack on, beyond fighting in Ukraine, what do you see as the value of in-country training of troops versus, let's say, conducting those training missions in Poland or Germany? Thanks.
Thanks. Lady in the green jacket in the fourth row.
Thank you. Aydin Matley, I'm with the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin. Mr. Lapsley, if I may, you mentioned that about 500,000 NATO troops are at a high readiness level by now. Could you elaborate on how that figure is measured? In other words, does that figure refer to on-paper calculations or to actuality? Because looking at my country, Germany, I have serious doubts whether Germany is able to muster about, well, above 30,000 troops by 2025, as the German Ministry of Defense has promised. Thank you.
And we have gentleman Al Sutton, I see him there, on the fifth row.
Thank you. Jim, a former retired commission official and not a defense expert. Two questions very bluntly. Is Turkey a weak link in NATO, first? And secondly, what about cooperation with non-NATO countries? I'm thinking of Russia's neighbor to the east, Japan. Is that, because we're going to need diplomatic, political, and possibly, I don't know, military support, but anyway, what about those two questions? Thank you.
Thanks. Let's go back to the panel at this stage, starting this time with, can I start with Mina and work back to Harry?
Well, in Finland, this debate hasn't been entirely concluded on the troops. So our foreign minister has been very sort of positive about this attempt to introduce more strategic ambiguity. There's been quite some substantial frustration in Finland with this, especially German habit to list 2 things that they will do and 10 things that they will not do. So that has been welcomed. However, I think that we are still being strategically ambiguous on our position. As you mentioned, the president has come out against it, the foreign minister for it, or like at least for the idea of like not excluding anything. I think this really depends on like how the war develops. So the interesting thing is that the president and the foreign minister are from the same party, or their background is in the same party. The Finnish Greens, however, are totally all in for this idea of sending troops to Ukraine. So there are some differing opinions. And then on whether Turkey is a weak link, well, Turkey for sure has sort of like its own way of approaching things, sort of like it looks like sort of trying to have the cake and eat it too. I would say that this is precisely from the Finnish experience, this is very important to consider when talking about Ukraine's membership perspective and how and when we should open the or make it sort of like with a due date or something, because in Finland, there is like a deep sense of gratitude to Ukraine for the fact that we were able to join NATO, and that actually we had a very peaceful accession process because Russia was so preoccupied and bogged down in Ukraine that they didn't have capacity free to do much against the Finnish accession. But it was also a very sort of like traumatic experience that Finland did an extensive diplomatic process beforehand, before even submitting the application, trying to make sure that there are no objections to our membership, so that we don't end up in this kind of a limbo. And then Turkey and Hungary, like very last minute coming out with their objections was exactly like what was not supposed to happen. And I think that this would be extremely dangerous for Ukraine as well, even more so than for Finland and Sweden. Like for us, it was an inconvenience, but for Ukraine, it could be very fatal and also in a sense to NATO. So we need to be smart about this. But yeah, Finland definitely supports Ukraine's perspective.
Angus?
So on training in Ukraine, I think it's actually really difficult to generalize about this because it all depends exactly what you're trying to do. So some forms of training, it's almost certainly easier to do it outside Ukraine, where you can do large-scale things without worrying about having to protect the force that you're training. So that's the first question, is kind of practically what are you trying to achieve at what kind of scale? And then the second issue is, do you want to then talk about it or not? And again, there are pros and cons of doing that. On the troops for NATO itself, so the 500,000 are troops which allies have declared to SACA as being usable. Now they're across all domains, so they're not all soldiers. Some of them will be air personnel, maritime personnel. There are, of course, many more troops in Europe than that, which speaks to your point that not all of them are usable, not all of them are ready. And that's precisely why we do need to invest a lot more training capabilities, etc. And on Turkey, I mean, look, from my perspective, Turkey is geographically and militarily really important to the collective defense of Europe. Really important, as it has been since the 1950s, and they make a really important contribution in lots of ways.
All right, I think I'll take the Japan Indo-Pacific 4 question. So, you know, we've made a lot of progress from a U.S. perspective in explaining to the rest of the alliance why we think the challenges that are happening in the Indo-Pacific and the challenge presented by China is something that NATO has to care about. If you look at the latest strategic concept and compare it to the previous one where there was no mention of China at all, I think that speaks for itself. But it's not as if the alliance is saying that suddenly all the allies have to be present and aligning their forces to a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, the plan against Russia and terrorism as the two main threats, and China is just named in that strategic concept as a long-term challenge to the alliance's interests. So with regard to that, we focus on challenges to enablement of SACEUR's area of responsibility. So is there Chinese ownership of communication systems or railways or ports, points of infrastructure that would be needed to move things across Europe in a conflict? And if so, is that a concern? So really focusing on China in Europe rather than NATO in the Indo-Pacific. And that brings me to the kind of the first part of your question on Japan. and I'd add Australia and New Zealand and South Korea to that group. They are countries who have been partners of NATO for a period of time, but with what's going on in Ukraine, with increasing disinformation and hybrid activity, there's a new impetus for that cooperation between NATO and what we call the IP4, because they have important lessons to learn, to share with NATO about disinformation. What does disinformation in the Indo-Pacific look like? What are the PRC's motives? How might they be different than the way Russia has gone about disinformation and hybrid activities? And we have that sort of exchange. The other area where we pursue close cooperation with Japan and others is in creating more resilient supply chains, as well as technological cooperation. There's a lot we can learn from each other and work together to make sure that we're becoming stronger. But the last point I would make on that is it's really important with any partnership to follow the lead of the partner. It's got to be a two-way conversation. So if a country like Japan says, I'm not ready for a NATO presence in my country, or I'm not sure I want to participate in that flagship project, but I'd really be happy to participate in this exercise, I think we need to listen to that and calibrate our approach. Because at the end of the day, countries need to be cognizant of the region in which they live, and we need to respect that. And I think that would extend to the question on Turkey.
Thanks. It also begs a question about the quality of dialogue with China itself, but this probably would take another session. Harry, on this group of questions, and we have time for one more after this.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. On the values of in-country training, at least two. One, political, and it's a message of support. And second, there's a practical one. It speeds up the feedback loop. Of course, Ukrainians benefit from training from us, but we also benefit in the sense that, we're also learning on how that actually plays out effectively on the field. So that's one. On the troops on the ground in Ukraine, I mean, even us with the international working group, we kind of stayed short of that. We didn't argue for troops on the ground. I mean, first, let's see, if there's, at least we can think about, having an extended area of defense, and then, we can think about that. We saw, of course, Macron's statements. We have to see what that will look like after July 4th, after the elections. But if we look historically in previous cases, how did we do it in South Korea or West Germany or Japan? I mean, ultimately, those democracies there were propped up by troops on the ground. Turkey, is it a weak link? Yes, but it's not the only one. There's also Hungary. And here, I can understand the American argument when they say, how do you expect us to take on something like an invite for Ukraine in an election year, and then Hungary and Turkey would shoot it down. Yes, that is a fact. Lastly, Japan cooperation. It's actually happening. So if you noticed, right before the U.S. signed its security agreement with Ukraine, Japan signed also security agreements with Ukraine, of course, tailored to what Japan can do. Japan cannot assist militarily, but it can assist with non-lethal items. And here, a lot of that stood at the core of that was the Kiev Security Compact that we started working on it even 2 years ago. What will be interesting to see, and perhaps it could happen at the sidelines of NATO, is to see how all these separate bilateral security agreements work with each other. We haven't yet defined that. So maybe, there's room for here to do more and have let's say a framework or a compact extended over all these partners so they can define how they will cooperate with each other.
Thanks, Harry. We're perilously close to lunch, so we've got time for one last group of three. Gentlemen in the front here. Would you like to?
Hi, thank you for great presentations. My name is Alvin Aronson from the Swedish Defence Research Agency. So my question is primarily for Rachel and Angus, but please chime in. So a lot of the NATO documents, the DDA concept, the military strategy, and some of the plans were largely developed before the full-scale invasion of 2022. And right now in the strategic concept, there is a compromise of defending forward and persistent presence on the eastern flank, and notably not forward defense. So, first question is, how would you characterize NATO's current deterrence and defense strategy? Perhaps in a classical sense, is it deterrence by punishment or something else? And what I said about that the plans and strategies were largely developed before early 2022, do you see a need to revise NATO's strategy in the coming years? And if so, perhaps how? Thank you.
Thanks. Maretta in the second row there. Can you? And the last one, lady at the back, I see your hand up, way back, way back there in the depths of the...
Hello, my name is Renat Robot, and I represent two charity foundations. One is focusing on the humanitarian aid in Ukraine, another one in the military, called Ukraine. And the thing is, we fundraise for drones, communication, and we hear what our soldiers say. So we listen actually what they say, what they demand. And then at some point, they demand high-precision weapons. That's clear, we cannot provide it. But they also provide cheap, they also demand some cheap weapons, like drones. And it's also about the cost. And most of the technology, when you speak about the NATO transformation, I'd say you would speak about some high-precision weapons, which cost lots of money. My question be, are there any talks among NATO countries to make the production of some weapons cheap and actually start producing and start supplying some armies with them already? And another one about the supply chains, because our charity foundation imports lots of Chinese drones. And this is another question. And I don't speak already about the gunpowder. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, let's start this time with Angus.
Thank you. So I'm confident I'll be working for an excellent Secretary General come September. The exact timing of that decision is what I think the Germans call Chefsache. It's not for me to answer. Look, on the plans and the strategy. So you're right that the overarching strategy, what we call the DDA, the strategy for the defence and deterrence of the North Atlantic area, that was adopted before the beginning of the war. In Ukraine, but actually the regional plans, which are the sort of bedrock of the operational planning that we are now doing, they largely emerged after the war in Ukraine, and of course, we would not necessarily face exactly the same scenarios as Ukraine has faced. What I would say about it's a sort of military truism that planning is more important than plans. And the planning is non-stop and constantly evolving. So, for example, at the moment, a lot of work going on to fully integrate Sweden into the plans, just as Finland has already been done. And the command and control structures that support those plans, the capabilities that support those plans, they will all evolve over time. So it's an inherently dynamic process. And on the question from the back about sort of cheaper capabilities versus more expensive ones. So I think we are learning a huge amount from the war in Ukraine about what the mix can be and how to integrate cheaper capabilities really quickly into the armed forces. Some allies are deliberately focusing on that as part of how they support Ukraine. So I think the UK, for example, announced recently an initiative to manufacture low-cost drones in the UK to support Ukrainian armed forces. The interesting question we're grappling with is what's the right balance for our own forces in future as well. And you will still need some large, complex platforms to do things. It's not an either-or question.
Okay. I'll focus on Mareda's question about perceptions versus reality. this is a concern because, particularly in the space of defense planning and defense investment, as Angus said previously, it's not that you can get to 2% one year and make a couple of decisions and then it's done. It has to be an investment for the long term. There has to be predictability for industry and planners and people in uniform. They have to know that this investment is going to last decades. And so the type of long-term planning that I know the United States does and some other allies do, where they look out 5 to 10 years and they have a strategy that's aligned with a budget that's credible. I think that's the best kind of planning to give predictability to that investment and to ensure that the plans deliver both capabilities and forces. Don't underestimate the ability of NATO allies to hold one another accountable. When Germany had the Zeitenwende and went to 2%, all the smaller countries that had been hiding behind Germany suddenly felt pressure to get to 2%. We now just have a few countries that don't have a plan to get to 2%, and I saw Foreign Minister Joly yesterday as one of them saying that Canada will have a plan by the July summit. So I
would like a Belgian plan that wasn't in the mid-2030s.
Correct. Even Luxembourg will be ahead of you. They've come in at 2030. So again, this sort of peer pressure and holding one another accountable is very important in making sure that the plans are not just a perception, but they're a reality. And then the final piece of that is what Angus and his team do, is making sure that the plans are aligned to a NATO defense planning process that has capability targets and force readiness targets, and then we test and validate that readiness in terms of the forces. And in terms of the capabilities, we're really looking at that industrial side. And in fact, the United States and some other allies had put forward what we call the NICE pledge. It's a defense investment pledge that tries to marry up the capability targets with an industrial plan, whether it's through the EU or nationally or NATO or regional groupings, to make sure that the targets have aren't just a what, there's a how we get there aspect to it.
Yeah, I think one lesson we're learning in the UK at the moment from the election campaign there is that the more politicians speak about having a plan, the more you know that they don't. Let's go to Harry.
Real quick on the drones. It's not even so much that Ukrainians don't have, because they've actually developed quite a lot of drones. And not only that, but of course other systems as well. Sometimes what is missing is a conversation on how to prop up that industry. Or fund joint ventures, Western and Ukrainian ventures. Having, for instance, a Western, radar on a Ukrainian artillery piece, for example. I know that Denmark has started to think about that, but at the level, between allies or some or select group of allies, I don't think there's that yet. But I think there's a lot of room for that because there's a lot of potential in Ukraine, and there's a lot of things actually Ukrainians can do cheaper and better. And there's a lot of room, of course, for these joint type of ventures.
Last word goes to Mina.
Just also on the gunpowder question and this China reliance and so on, there's work in progress in Finland on the R&D side to develop an alternative for this cotton from China, and it would be wood cellulose. It seems to work. The Nordics have been also individually and together really ramping up, for example, the ammunition production, both for regional needs but also for Ukraine. The problem here is, though, that a lot of this is actual manufacture, so it's not even industrialized in many cases yet, like artillery shells and so on. So unfortunately, that takes some time, and European countries didn't quite start with the process early enough.
Thanks, Mina. And I think we have to draw it to a close. So it just remains for me to apologize to all of you who wanted to ask questions but didn't have time. But I think it was testimony to the quality of debate that so many people had their hands up. Number two, you will see behind me a QR code, which is quite harmless and is there for you to give your feedback on the event today, if you have the time and you have the inclination. It would be very nice if you could go up and take that and then answer a few questions on a form. And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to show our appreciation for what was an excellent panel. I think you'll agree with me today. Give them a hand. Bon appetit. Don't forget your things. You did very well despite the threat.
No, you know, it comes and goes. Thank you.
You'll pay the price this afternoon.
Yes. Good job moderating. Felt very balanced.